Hey, what's up guys, welcome back, it's Tarek Salim, and today we will talk about Grandjs. And actually this is the first tutorial for Grandjs framework. So let's start with the common question about what actually Grandjs means, or what is Grandjs. Actually Grandjs is a server-side framework based on nodejs and JavaScript, and it's a server-side framework for building robust server-side applications based on nodejs, TypeScript, and JavaScript. And actually, Grandjs is a sum of utilities and methods you can use, and some internal libraries you can use to build full application or full backend application based on nodejs and TypeScript. And initially Grandjs is built upon JavaScript in 2017, and after getting more popularity it's converted to TypeScript, and now JavaScript is built upon TypeScript, fully implemented in TypeScript. And actually it depends on TypeScript in many things. And you can find that the main website of Grandjs here on this link, which is grandjs.netlify.app, and I will put it in comments. And actually Grandjs, this is the main documentation of Grandjs. Actually Grandjs implements some internal libraries and some external libraries that allow you build full application without need to any other library or any other framework. The main purpose of Grandjs is allowing you to build your web application, your scaled web application, easily without the hassle of the architecture. And if you can find here, actually the introduction about Grandjs. If you want to build a solid web application, but you don't want to use Express and a lot of packages, you need to build a basic website. Grandjs has one framework includes all main functionalities you need to build amazing and solid and secure web application without need to ton of packages and libraries. However, you can use Grandjs for scaled application and for big application, because Grandjs ships to you a lot of functionalities and methods you can build with them any type of web application or any type of server-side application. What are the features of Grandjs? You can use fewer packages. You don't need a lot of packages and the headache of the implementation of these packages. And the framework includes the most needed functionalities to build a perfect web application in performance. Perfect means in performance, and it depends. It was depending on handle pause for template engine. However, now Grandjs supports JSX Components for server-side rendering, and we will take a look on all these features later in the coming videos and coming tutorials. Actually, Grandjs ships to you a solid routing system, and this routing system actually built upon JavaScript and TypeScript object-oriented programming, and also implements decorators and fun stuff in TypeScript. And Grandjs is built for extendable and solid web application, not just for small web application, because Grandjs targets all type of web applications. And the objective of Grandjs is to be the successor of Express. We know Express is pretty good and enough for small applications, but you when building an application in Express.js, you can find yourself do the architecture by yourself. So you build your application by dividing and structuring the code by your mind, and maybe something will fail from you, and you'll find sometimes your skilled application doesn't follow a strong pattern or doesn't follow a strong architecture, and Grandjs comes to fill this gap. And actually Grandjs comes to be the successor of Express and to shape to you the clear architecture you need to build a scaled web application. So what are the packages of Grandjs, or the Grandjs depends on? Grandjs uses the core Grandjs package, which is the main library for Grandjs, and this library actually contains the most things you need to build a small application. You have Grandjs core, and actually Grandjs core implements a lot of stuff such as sessions, cores and flash messages, MIME types, JSX components for rendering server-side components. You can follow this like React, but this is as a template engine for server-side rendering. Actually Grandjs core gives you a routing system which you can use to build extendable routing system and strong routing system. Also Grandjs gives you the ability to upload files and download files and so on, and all this stuff Grandjs ships to you without any need to external library. However, you can also implement Express libraries and Express middlewares inside Grandjs, which is important thing you can do or you may need. You can here access on request and response. Take a look on the implementation of the router and how you can render your views or render your APIs and so on. So you can just start implementing your homepage router, for example, which is a class method, and define your URL, the method and the handler which takes the request and response, and then render your views. Actually you can send file. It implements a lot of stuff like Express. You have response.json, response.status and so on. You have the chaining of the response, and all this stuff that you know in Express you can find in Grandjs. Also Grandjs core gives you two methods for ciphering and encrypting data, and you can encrypt and decrypt data, and also you can hash your texts or your data. So you don't need bcrypt library or anything for small implementation. Also Grandjs comes with external libraries, and these external libraries such as Grandvalidator, and actually Grandvalidator is a library built with Grandjs team to validate your data. You can define here schema, and you can put your specification inside this schema. That's how Joy does, and also Express Validator Advanced does. And also you have the ability to define that this is object ID for MongoDB. You can define the schema as an any type. You can define it as a function and so on. So you have all the implementation for Grandjs validator. And also you have an external library which is GrandModel, and actually GrandModel is a way for modeling your data, and is a way for modeling your schemas, your data. And actually Grandjs is implemented as a middle layer between your API or your API definitions and also between the underlying layer, which is database layer. So you can use Grand model for modeling your data before going to Mongoose. And we will take a look on how to implement a Grand model with Mongoose and to build a strong typed application and strong definitions for your entities. So with Grandjs, basically you can define entities, and each entity you can define its properties and its methods. So here you can define a method, and all this stuff you can implement inside Mongoose if you use MongoDB as a database, or you can also implement in SQLize if you are using SQL database. And this Grand model actually depends on Grand validator for validating data. So you can use this as a middle layer between your API implementation or API definition and between your database layer. And also we have Grand connectors, which is another external library built with Grandjs team, and actually this is the most important part in Grandjs ecosystem, because with Grandjs connectors you have the ability to connect your application paths together to build a strong and so strong backend or server-side application. And actually Grand connectors ships to you some functionalities and some methods you can use, some classes also, to define your repository. So if you want to build a strong application in Node.js, you have to follow some patterns, and one of these strong patterns, which are clean architecture and repository pattern. So you can search here, for example, about clean architecture and in Node.js, and also you can search on repository pattern in Node.js. So let's take a look on clean architecture and how this is implemented commonly, and how Grandjs implements this inside its ecosystem. So if you have a look, you have entities and some use cases and some controllers and then external devices. And actually Grandjs implements the same thing inside its ecosystem. So you can build your entities with Grand model and add some use cases with Grand connectors. So you can use something called repository. Okay, and so you have here the repository, and actually you can define your repository and add a lot of functionalities inside this repository. And inside this repository you can inject your entities, and also you can define something called data sources, which are a way to connect your databases and inject these data sources inside the repository. So you can here extend the data source and define the type of this data source as a Mongoose, for example, and here add the connection, and automatically Grandjs will connect with your data source, and you can inject then this data source inside Grandjs repository. So you can here inject data source, and then you can inject your defined models and defined entities inside Grandjs repository. And actually Grandjs connectors plays an important role in Grandjs ecosystem, because it enables you to connect your application parts together. So after the repository layer, you have another layer which is the controller layer, and this controller layer actually can contact with the socket service if you have socket service, and also it can contact with for example, it can contact with the API router and so on. After that, you have an advanced level, and this advanced level actually which is a library called Grafka. And actually Grafka is a package helper for applying event-driven architecture in your monolithic application. So imagine you have an application which is monolithic application, and this application built in nodejs, and you need for example, you have registration form for some users, and once the user register in your form, you wanna send a verification code on email and SMS verification code also on mobile device, and you also want to send notification for these users via email and so on. So imagine in registration for this user, simply you will use your controller to contact to database, save the user, and then return the response and call the controller or call email service inside your controller, and will call also SMS service inside your controller. And if you want, after some time you want to add another functionality or another notification channel, rather than notification via SMS and notification via email, so you will need to update your controller to call this another service inside your sign up controller. And actually this is a nice implementation for small scaling, but you can do best and better than that, and actually you can use something like Grafka. And actually Grafka works as being your or keeping your application paths works alone, and the code and everything works alone. And actually Grafka listens for your events you trigger from anywhere inside your application, and then takes something called consumer, and this consumer takes these events and works on them. So what about Grafka? Actually Grafka is a TypeScript package that helps you write high scalable web application using event-driven architecture inside your monolithic application. So instead of calling your services inside the other functions or controllers, you can easily inject your services inside Grafka brokers and just fire event from anywhere inside your application, and your services will work as a charm. So you have sign up controller, you just call something called the producer inside this controller, and you can define inside this producer the channel or the topic you wanna fire this events on. And you have something called a broker, and inside this broker some topics and some consumers, and these consumers listens for the events that are triggered on these topics. And once event is triggered, the matched consumer will work, or matched consumers will work on these events. So what are the use cases of Grafka? So imagine you have a Node.js application that has user registration. So when the user registers, you should send an email or SMS verification to verify his account, and this action can be done normally by calling the mail service and SMS service inside your controller. And after saving the new user in the database, you call the mail service or SMS service directly in your controller and to send the verification. But Grafka allows you to make your controller does one function. So your controller just do one function and say I done. So another consumers will work on and proceed after this controller finishes its work. So what are the dependencies? And you can find here the implementation of Grafka. And actually Grafka, this name is driven from Apache Kafka, which is a good implementation on event-driven architecture in distributed systems. And you can find here the architecture of Grafka. You have broker, and this consumer is connected to this broker, and also you have producer, and this producer can trigger messages or trigger events, and these events go to this broker, and this broker finds the matching consumers and sends this message to them. And you can find here use producer, which is the producer and trigger events go to broker, and this go to topic, and then go to consumer, and the consumer can send the feedback to broker. So all these things about Grandjs, and this is the first tutorial for Grandjs, and we will go to in the next tutorial to start or to get started with Grandjs and implementation. Thanks guys for watching, and see you in the next tutorial.